At its peak, Oxo wasn't just food, it was medicine, morale, advertising genius, and a quiet promise that dinner would taste right. It fed Victorian sick rooms, marched into the trenches, climbed onto the London skyline, and moved into Britain's living rooms every night on television. Then, without drama, it slipped from certainty to option. This is how a beef cube built an empire, and how modern Britain slowly outgrew it without ever noticing it happen. Long before a brown cube lived in a tin beside the stove, the whole thing started with a chemistry problem. How do you take the goodness of meat and trap it in a jar? In the 1840s, Justus von Liebig was one of the big names of European science. He wasn't trying to invent a trendy flavoring. His aim was much more earnest: turn beef into something concentrated, portable, and nourishing enough that even people on low incomes could afford real protein. Boil bones and meat for hours, reduce the liquid, concentrate it further, and you end up with a dark, sticky extract that smells strongly of beef and dissolves in hot water. On paper, it sounded like a social good. In practice, there was a brutal obstacle: the price of cattle. In Europe, meat itself was already expensive. By the time animals had been raised, slaughtered, processed, and then boiled down, the extract that emerged from Liebig's method couldn't be sold for pennies. Instead of landing on the tables of the urban poor, it drifted upwards into a very different world. Doctors and hospital kitchens liked it. So did middle-class households, who saw it as a strengthening drink for invalids and children who were run down. A teaspoon in hot water was marketed as something close to medicine, the kind of thing you'd be given in a sick room rather than in a bustling family kitchen. Meat extract, in other words, began life with a slightly clinical reputation, closer to a tonic than to gravy. The breakthrough only came when Liebig's idea left Europe altogether. In 1865, investors set up the Liebig's Extract of Meat Company in London, drawing on huge herds of cattle in South America, especially around Fray Bentos in Uruguay, to mass-produce meat extract on a scale and at a cost that could finally support a global brand. Once that river of South American beef extract was flowing, the next challenge was giving it a personality ordinary shoppers could latch onto. By the late 19th century, Liebig's meat extract had carved out a clear presence. It sat on chemists' shelves and in respectable kitchens as a thick, dark liquid sold in small jars, recommended by doctors and recognized by name. It was trusted. It was also still on the pricey side and didn't exactly scream everyday family dinner. Lemko's answer was to strip the whole idea back and rebuild it as something simpler and friendlier. In 1899, they registered a short, punchy trademark, Oxo. The exact origin of the name has never been nailed down, but it almost certainly leans on the word ox and the association with beef. 2 letters, 1 symbol, easy to print, easy to remember, and, importantly, easy to spot on a label from across a crowded shop. With the new name came a shift in tone. Instead of framing the product as a kind of liquid medicine for the frail, Oxo was sold as a comforting drink and a handy way to deepen flavor in soups, gravies, and stews. A spoonful in hot water was no longer just a remedy. It was something you might have simply because you fancied a hot, savory cup. Lemko backed that up with marketing that treated Oxo as part of modern domestic life. Recipe leaflets showed housewives how to stretch a joint or brighten up leftovers. Branded gifts and promotions made the logo familiar long before radio and television advertising. Posters, print ads, and in-store displays all pushed the same idea. This wasn't a mysterious laboratory product anymore. It was a small, scientifically respectable helper that made an ordinary kitchen feel up to date. Even with the friendlier name and homely advertising, there was a stubborn problem Oxo couldn't ignore. The liquid still locked a lot of people out. A jar on the shelf was fine if you had spare cash and space, but for working families budgeting meal by meal, it was a bit of a luxury. You were paying for a whole container at once, not for the odd spoonful you dropped into a pot. So Lemko poured money and effort into a different question. Could they turn this sticky, concentrated liquid into a solid portion you could sell one at a time? The answer arrived in 1910 as something deceptively simple: a small pressed block of concentrated flavor that could be wrapped, stacked, and shipped all over the country. That block became the Oxo Cube, and the key detail wasn't just its shape, it was the price. A single cube for a penny, brought concentrated stock within reach of the working and lower middle-class households, Lemco hadn't quite managed to win over. You didn't have to commit to a jar. You could just buy one or two with your other groceries and stretch a stew a little further that night. The cube itself suited the new world of branded packaged food. It was small enough to tuck into a pantry or a tin, robust enough to survive transport, and dry enough that you didn't have to worry about it spoiling in a damp British kitchen. Crumble it into a pan, dissolve it in a jug, or drop it straight into a pot of simmering vegetables. It slotted neatly into whatever routine you already had. Within a few years, those little brown squares were turning up in cookbooks, household hints columns, and everyday shopping lists, as if they'd always been part of British cooking. By the time Europe slid into war in 1914, Oxo already had the perfect shape for conflict. A ration you could carry in your pocket. A jar of thick liquid wouldn't survive a journey to the front, but a small wrapped block tucked easily into crates, kit bags and field kitchens. During the First World War, the British Armed Forces ordered Oxo on a huge scale. The company supplied somewhere in the region of 100 million cubes, many of them still wrapped by hand. That isn't just a marketing boast, it reflects how completely the little brown block fitted into the ration system. You could ship it in bulk, count it easily, hand it out by the cube, and every soldier knew what to do with it. Out in training camps and trenches, Oxo's role was simple. Heat some water, drop in a cube, and you had a salty, beef-flavoured drink that gave you warmth, salt, and a brief sense of being looked after. It wasn't a full meal, and nobody pretended it was. But in cold, wet conditions, a hot mug of anything that tasted like home had value far beyond its calories. Men drank it on night watches, on breaks from drills, and during long stretches of waiting for orders. Those habits mattered. In that setting, Oxo stopped being just a domestic convenience and started to feel like part of endurance itself. It was something you had during the worst weather, after the hardest marches, in the quiet after shelling, when those soldiers went back to civilian life. Many of them carried those associations with them. Back home, a cube in a stew or a cup of hot Oxo didn't just belong to tidy recipe leaflets anymore. It had the rough, practical image of something that had proved itself alongside the men who'd used it. Once the guns fell silent, Oxo didn't retreat. It simply found new places to show its face. In fact, that urge to be seen had started even before the war. At the 1908 London Olympic Games, Oxo provided fortified drinks to marathon runners, getting its name associated with stamina and high performance long before energy gels and sports drinks existed. Decades later, when Coca-Cola liked to present itself as the pioneer of big brand sports sponsorship, Oxo could quietly point back to those cups of beefy liquid on a chilly London course. In the 1920s, the brand went one step further and claimed its own patch of skyline. The company took over a wharf on the south bank of the Thames and developed what would become known as the Oxo Tower. Planning rules at the time restricted illuminated advertising on the river, so the designers simply built the branding into the architecture. 3 sets of windows in a vertical column, circle, cross, circle, formed the word Oxo without a single painted sign. Anyone drifting along the river or crossing the bridges had that name in their eyeline. Away from landmarks and marathons, Oxo kept working on the slower, quieter job of burrowing into everyday life. Between the wars and into the middle of the 20th century, the company pushed out recipe booklets, kitchen calendars, branded giveaways and posters. They showed thrifty roasts with extra rich gravy, stews that could be made from cheaper cuts, and simple soups that felt a bit more substantial with a cube dissolved in them. By the middle of the century, Oxo had done something very few brands manage. It wasn't just a product on the shelf. In a lot of homes, saying you were putting a bit of Oxo in was simply how you described making dinner taste like a proper, gravy-heavy meal. Once Oxo had a solid place in the cupboard, and even on the skyline, the next frontier was the living room TV. By the late 1950s, television was settling in as evening entertainment, and Oxo moved quickly to claim a slot in that new ritual. In 1958, the company launched Life with Katie, a series of short ads built around a capable housewife, her husband, and the meals that seemed to revolve, one way or another, around Oxo. These weren't just straight product demonstrations. They played more like mini sitcom scenes, little domestic moments, a bit of dialogue, a family joke, with the gravy or the stock quietly tying it together. The campaign ran into the early 1970s, long enough that Katie became a recognizable character rather than just a face. As tastes and television styles shifted, Oxo updated the format. In the 1970s, actor Dennis Waterman fronted a new run of ads that nudged the brand away from the stiff apron and perm image of the 50s and towards something that felt more in step with contemporary British families. The core idea stayed the same though. You weren't just sold a cube, you were shown a mood. The big leap came in 1983 when Oxo introduced an entirely new Oxo Family starring Linda Bellingham and Michael Redfern as mum and dad. Over the next 16 years, viewers watch those characters age, kids grow up, partners come and go, all around the same kitchen table. Oxo cubes and gravy appeared so naturally in the background that sometimes the product barely needed naming. What stuck were the familiar rhythms: playful bickering, last-minute dinners, small dramas solved with a meal. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, that run had turned Oxo from a brand with adverts into one of British television's longest-running advertising storylines and into the default emotional reference point for a proper family tea. While the Oxo family was smiling on TV, the real brand was being shuffled around boardrooms and factories. The product that started as Liebig's meat extract didn't stay in the hands of the same company for long. In 1924, the Vesti Group acquired Liebig's Extract of Meat Company and folded it into a bigger meat empire. Later, in 1968, that business merged with tea giant Brooke Bond, which in turn was taken over by Unilever in 1984. On paper, Oxo had become a small piece of a very large multinational puzzle. That pattern continued into the new century. In 2001, Unilever sold Oxo and some of its soup brands to the Campbell Soup Company, shifting the center of gravity towards an American-owned business. Only a few years later, in 2006, Campbell's UK operation, including Oxo and the worksop factory that made the cubes, was bought by Premier Foods. Each deal came with new priorities, different portfolio strategies, new cost targets, new ideas about what counted as good enough for a stock cube. During the same decades, the contents of the cube were evolving. The early promise of concentrated beef gave way to recipes that leaned far more on autolyzed yeast extract and flavor enhancers, like MSG. That change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't unique to Oxo. It reflected wider food science trends and the pressure to keep a familiar taste while controlling costs and shelf life. For most shoppers, the cube still did the same job in the pan, but the ingredient list told a quieter story about how far the product had drifted from its 19th century origins. And Oxo didn't behave the same way in every country. In South Africa, the brand was best known as a savoury yeast extract spread rather than a stock cube, a kind of cousin to Marmite that was eventually discontinued in 2015. It's a neat reminder that behind the famous red logo, some versions of Oxo survived reinvention and others simply disappeared. By the late 1990s, the world that Oxo advertised and the way people actually ate had started to part company. More women were working full-time, more households were headed by a single parent, and more meals were grabbed in front of the TV, at desks, or on the way home. The slow nightly ritual of everyone sitting down at the same table still existed, but it no longer felt like the default setting for the country. That tension eventually caught up with the ads. In 1999, the long-running Oxo Family campaign was finally retired. Linda Bellingham herself later acknowledged that the traditional nuclear family, gathered religiously for a hot dinner every evening, just didn't match the lives most viewers were living anymore. The fantasy had done its job for 16 years. Now it looked dated. At the same time, Oxo was getting squeezed where it hurt, on the shelf. Bisto had become the giant of the gravy world. By the mid-2000s, it controlled well over half the UK gravy market, with Oxo holding a much smaller slice, and supermarket-owned brands advancing quickly. If you just wanted gravy granules for Sunday lunch, the automatic reach was for the brown drum, not the red cubes. The stock cube itself was under pressure too. Chilled liquid stocks, ready-made cooking sauces, and a growing range of global pastes and seasonings took over some of the jobs cubes used to do by default. You could still crumble an Oxo into a stew, but you were far less likely to treat it as the only way to get depth of flavor. In 2009, headlines about the classic crumbly cube being replaced by a new Oxo X format summed up the moment. The company was clearly trying to refresh the product and solve practical complaints, while still leaning hard on the red logo and the decades of nostalgia behind it. Sales remained significant, but the shift was obvious. Oxo was no longer the taken-for-granted taste of a British roast. It had become one option among many, competing for attention in a much noisier kitchen. In the 21st century, Oxo hasn't vanished so much as blended into a much bigger picture. It now sits inside Premier Foods' lineup alongside Bisto, Mr. Kipling, Ambrosia, and a cluster of other big night-in names. When Premier talks about performance, it talks about the health of the whole portfolio. Oxo still matters, but it's one contributor to the numbers, not the single star they hang everything on. The manufacturing story is more stable than the corporate history that came before. The cubes are still produced in worksop, and instead of relying on one flagship format, the brand has spread out. There are traditional cubes, softer stock pots, pourable stocks, marinades, and even bone broth-style products aimed at the health-conscious end of the market. The idea is simple. However you cook now, slow cooker, tray bake, midweek stir-fry, there's an Oxo product that can slot in. The nostalgia isn't ignored. In 2016, Premier Foods briefly revived a modernized Oxo family in its TV ads, this time with more equal gender roles, sharper jokes, and a looser, contemporary feel. It was a deliberate nod to the old campaign, but also an admission that the original fantasy of mum dishing up to dad and kids every night belonged to another era. Day to day, Oxo's fortunes rise and fall with broader grocery trends. Recent trading updates from Premier make it clear that brands like Oxo are sensitive to things as mundane as a warm winter, or people buying fewer big roasts and more quick modular meals. Gravy and stock still sell, but they're not the automatic weekly staples they were in the 1960s. So the fall in Oxo's story isn't a collapse. It's the shift from being a national shorthand for home cooking to being a solid, mature product competing for space in a crowded aisle. Still on the shelf, still in plenty of cupboard, just no longer the unquestioned king.